This was the debate with the Dallas prof, Justin Bass, on the subject of the deity of Christ, and specifically whether Jesus believed himself to be divine. And we've already noted that Bart's primary approach here is going to be to limit not only the range of information that can be brought into the debate, but the method of interpretation that can be applied to it, to a naturalistic realm. So his idea is history is naturalistic. History cannot, you can't write a history saying God did this and God did that. If you allowed for that, then you would never be able to do meaningful history. So you have to come up with some other reason, background, cause than God. Now, of course, someone like myself would never say you don't do history by just simply going, well, whatever happened, God made it happen, and go home. There's obviously a balance to be found somewhere in here, but Dr. Ehrman doesn't believe that there is a balance. Dr. Ehrman likes to say he's a historian and use that as the means of avoiding the many contradictions and errors that he makes on a theological level. This is something he's done for a long, long time. But he is addressing a specifically theological issue, because history can't tell you what Jesus thought. And the whole idea of the deity of Christ is outside the realm of any naturalistic history in the first place. So why is he even bothering? Well, because he has a theological position. He just doesn't want to actually have to stand up and do the theology part. That's the problem. So we'll pick up where we last left off in listening to Bart's presentation. Here we go.
You want sources that are close to the time in which the events took place. You want sources that are consistent with one another. You want sources that corroborate one another, that say basically the same thing, and yet they say these things without having collaborated with one another. If you're a historian, this is your wish list. Suppose you want to write a biography of Alexander the Great. You want a lot of sources that are near his time, that are basically consistent with one another, that agree on how they present Alexander the Great and what he said and what he did, without having borrowed this information from each other. That's what you want as a historian. You want that for Alexander the Great, you want it for Julius Caesar, and you want it for Jesus. If you're approaching the New Testament as a historian, you have to bracket your personal theological beliefs. You have to approach it the way historians approach sources.
Okay, so once again, just briefly, not going to expand upon it. Every time we review Bart Ehrman, every time we review his debates, we've reviewed many of them. When I hear people saying, you Christians, you just sweep everything that doesn't go your way under the rug. That's not what we do on the dividing line. That's not our way of doing things. We take on these folks directly, and we let them speak, as we are doing right now. But here it is again, over and over again, same thing. That's not how historians do it. And he gets to define what the methodology needs to be. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the academy have so capitulated to the naturalistic worldview when it comes to how academics are done, that a lot of people on our side are really not in a position to put up much of a fight when it comes to the fact that from a Christian perspective, Jesus Christ is Lord of history. And the biblical teaching is that God is working out his purposes in history. Now, whatever else that means if you're going to be a consistent Christian, you can still be a historian, and you can still utilize the best methods of historical research. But you're going to have to think through the worldview issues especially when it comes to issues of motivation and answering questions of why, which most historians cannot answer and do not try to answer, by the way, because it's, from their perspective, beyond their purview.
New Testament, we do have numerous sources. We've got 4 of them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But these sources are problematic for historians. I'm not saying that they're problematic for believers. I'm not saying you shouldn't base your lives on the teachings of Jesus found in the New Testament. I'm saying if you want to know what Jesus really said and did, these sources are problematic. Let me explain why. If we're looking for those kinds of sources, what do we have in the New Testament?
Stop it there, not for any other reason than I was reminded just now of the fact that I learned after the last program that the man who asked the question of Bart Ehrman that I mentioned last time, and that is, what would you accept as proper confirmation that we have the original Gospel of Mark? Remember, it's interesting. People afterwards were immediately telling me, by the way, the person who asked that question was Justin Bass, the guy he's debating now, which I find fascinating. And the other thing was, did you notice what I did? I actually helped Bart out. I did. What Bart asked for was actually far more ridiculous than I even remembered it to be. I mean, what he asked for about, 10 copies of Mark written with him in like 10, I said what, like 6 months? I think it was 10 days. Signed by Mark. I mean, it was so outrageously ridiculous that in my mind, I could not imagine anyone of any scholarly level whatsoever who could actually put forward such an absurdity as that. And afterwards, people were sending me YouTube links to, there was a YouTube video that had Dan Wallace shortly after the debate talking about how he had demonstrated clearly that Bart Ehrman is a radical skeptic, and here's why, and he gave the exact things that Bart had demanded. And so there was a bunch of stuff that came through Twitter after the program that pointed out that, and I wasn't purposefully trying to help Bart out. It's just that, in the intervening couple of years, it just seems like, someone that intelligent just couldn't be that radical, I guess, and so it, and it actually was as bad as everybody said. So and then it was actually Justin Bass who asked that question, which is interesting that then they would end up being the two that are debating in this context.
First, the dates of the Gospels. Justin, sounds like we agree pretty much that the Gospels are written decades after the life of Jesus. Now,
I will take Bart's lead here. How many decades? This is an area where, if you want an example, you go into seminary, and if you've never put a lot of thought into the dating of the Gospels, when were the Gospels written? You go into seminary, and you're sitting there, and most of the time you can really tell that your professor has done a lot of work, really knows his stuff. I remember once, toward the end of my master's with Fuller, and pretty well-known Old Testament professor. I'm taking the prophets class from him. He had written a commentary on Esther. It was like this thick. Think about that for a second. How do you write a book that thick on Esther? Anyway, we had some other students and I were sitting there before class, and we had a question about Hebrew. And this is Dr. Hubbard from Denver. I guess there's no reason not to mention his name. And we asked him about it. And cold, no preparation, no nothing. Just glance at the text. Bing, 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 bing. There's your answer. You recognize that these guys really know what they're talking about. They've been around. They've been doing this stuff for a while. Okay. And so when they tell you that from their perspective, they think X, Y, and Z about areas that you've never really done a lot of thinking on, it's pretty easy to see why, without really listening to other sides, other perspectives, you end up developing a consensus. But it's a consensus of capitulation. It's a consensus of, well, it's just what everybody's saying. It's not because everyone's really done a lot of serious, in-depth work on it. And so when you talk about the dating of the Gospels, what's the basis for the late dating of the Gospels? Well, if you listen to Bart Ehrman's lectures, I didn't mean to freeze him in the middle of drinking his water, but if you listen to Bart Ehrman's lectures, he has certain theories about what the early church looked like. For example, one of the reasons he doesn't believe that 1st, 2nd Timothy or Titus are apostolic, that is written by Paul, is because the form of the church revealed therein is too advanced, given Ehrman's theory as to what the church was to look like at that time. Well, what if you don't accept Ehrman's theory about the evolution of the hierarchy of the Christian church? When you start really digging into the dating issue, there are all sorts of assumptions that have been made that are extremely challengeable, that push those dates farther and farther back. A number of people have made a very good argument that there are things said, especially in the Synoptic Gospels, especially in like the Olivet Discourse, that if those books were actually written after the destruction of Jerusalem, they don't make much sense. And they wouldn't have been written the way that they're written, because there seem to be things that are left unfulfilled. If you're writing after those events, why would you write the way that you did? But if you're writing prophetically, and especially if you see both near and far prophetic fulfillments in regards to judgment upon Israel, second coming of Christ, things like that, which gets into all the preterism stuff and all the rest of that stuff. If you think those things through, there's a lot of good reason to think that at least Mark and Matthew are pre-70. And there's a really good reason to think that Luke Acts is probably mid-50s. Why? There's a theory, it's a good theory, I think, that Luke Acts is a amicus brief. It is something that Luke submits to the Caesar as evidence of the fact that Christians are not the enemies of the Caesar, but that they are preaching a gospel that is centered upon who Jesus was. Here's what Jesus taught. His is a heavenly kingdom. We are teaching people to live lives that are just and righteous and to assist others and so on and so forth. If this was actually written, and notice how odd the ending of Acts is? Sort of like it's written Right around that time, huh? Well, if Paul's arrested mid-50s, late 50s, this would be long before the fall of Jerusalem. It would make sense for it to be written at that time. It wouldn't make much sense to be written later than that. And so but you never hear people talking about that. And when I talk with seminary graduates who just automatically buy late dating, oh yeah, Matthew's 80s and Luke's 90s and John's 110 or whatever, and I go, why? Have you thought about these things? Have you looked into this? Well, no, but my New Testament professor, she was just, that's what everybody says, isn't it? And so I would love to see a meaningful debate on the actual dating of the Gospels. I've not seen anything like that. Because if you really dug into it, you discover that so much of what has been accepted, even across the evangelical landscape, is just based upon presuppositions that not a lot of good reason to buy into those things. Now, was there a period of apostolic preaching? Of course there was. Am I saying that Mark was written, 20 days after the ascension of Jesus? No, of course not. There would be no reason to even think that. But personally, I think you can make a really strong argument for talking. Well, we know that Paul's writings are late 40s, mid 50s. We can pretty much demonstrate that, and Ehrman even accepts that, at least for the books of Paul that he accepts as being Pauline. He has a very minimized Pauline corpus, only 7 books. But when it comes to the Gospels, I think you can make a strong case. If you're going to put Mark first, late 40s. Matthew and Luke, I think, are pretty much concurrent and probably late 50s. John, some people have argued for a pre-70 John. I'm a little more comfortable with a later John. I think that would explain a lot of the differences. I think one of the reasons that you have some of the synoptic differences is because they're written so early that there are people that are still alive that they have to keep in mind that you can only say certain things in published works in light of the persecution that is currently taking place. John's far enough down the road that a lot of those issues aren't relevant anymore. So I don't have any problem putting John later, as he has traditionally been put. But some people have made an argument pre-70. Wow, there was a 10-minute discussion on the dating of the Gospels. Let's let Dr. Ehrman finish his drink and continue on.
I date the Gospels between 70 and 90 AD. Justin is dating them between 60 and 90. Fine. Jesus died around the year 30. That means the Gospels were written 30 to 60 years later. They are our earliest sources. The first account of Jesus' words comes to us from a source written 30, 40, 50 years later. Well, who wrote these books? Weren't they eyewitnesses? The author.
Now, did you catch that? 30, 40, 50 years later. Now, again, this is very effective in the modern context. It's very effective because we are living in a day of instant video coverage of everything, because we're all running around with these things, I mean, a couple years ago, the Japanese tsunami, I heard about it and saw it first because of Twitter. Saw a link from Twitter, then I turned the TV on. And they were behind what I had already seen online. Okay, so this is what we're used to. This is an absolutely unique period in human history on that level. Absolutely unique. Remember World War II? No, most of us don't. But you would be reading in the newspaper about battles that took place 2 weeks ago. That's just how it worked. Yeah, that's just how it worked. And so the idea of a 30, 40, 50 years, now I'm thinking more 15, 20, 30 years myself, but as meant to communicate to the modern secularist, oh yeah, can't trust any of that. And they'll actually, he and Justin will get into that later on in the discussion.
The New Testament Gospels do not claim to be eyewitnesses. They don't claim to be people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are written anonymously. They are not written in Jesus' native language, Aramaic. They're written in another language, Greek. They were not written by lower-class fishermen and other peasants. They were written by highly educated, Greek-speaking people living 40, 50 years later who were living in other parts of the world. That
is his theory, but he states it as a fact. He doesn't try to substantiate it. He assumes that Peter could not write what he wrote because it's too high for Peter, even though Peter has an amanuensis. He ignores the reality that Paul is a highly educated individual, and yet he's writing material that comes from the very earliest strata of tradition of the Christian faith. He looks at Matthew and Mark and Luke. Luke is obviously highly educated. There's no question of that. But why do you have to think that they're nowhere near? All the evidence of the use of patrimony, the place names, the knowledge of the geography of Palestine, Jerusalem, Judea, Galilee, all of it points to documents that are written by people who, at least at one point, even if they are not there now as they write, were at one point in those places and knew those places intimately. Otherwise, you have to do what he does, and that is accuse the authors of being disingenuous, of being dishonest, because they represent themselves as having been there and give clear evidence of their having been there. So here you have Bart Ehrman doing I'm the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor. You just listen to what I have to say. This is argumentum ad authoritam. Ugh, I am Bart Ehrman. Listen to me roar. And most people just go, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay. All right. And I go, no, afraid not. You can make those arguments if you want, but you aren't substantiating them. And that makes me wonder why. Why does your demeanor become one of the, when you don't have a good substantiation for your argument, yell louder. You've heard that one before? That's what you got here. That's what you got here. Very, very arguable assertions being made there. And yet they're central to his point.
Where did they get their information from? They don't tell us. Luke indicates that people have passed on this information from the time there were eyewitnesses, but what are his specific sources? He doesn't tell us. Mark doesn't tell us. Matthew doesn't tell us. John doesn't tell us. What scholars have long thought is that these stories have come down to the gospel writers by word of mouth. There weren't gospels floating around a year after Jesus died, or 2 years later, or 5.
Did you catch that, my Muslim friends? I completely agree that they are drawing from, now he's putting them someplace else, okay? So he's saying these are not individuals that have the direct connections that we would say Mark had to Peter, that Matthew had directly as a disciple, that Luke had with Paul, that John had as one of the disciples, or even if you take you can take the other theory that the Gospel of John is written by the beloved disciple who's not one of the 12, but one of the Jerusalem disciples. Doesn't really make any difference as far as the reliability of the information is concerned, to be perfectly honest with you. It really doesn't. But all those he's thrown those out, and so now you've got people out there someplace who are highly educated Greek speakers who are now going on what somebody told. This is what he wants you to be thinking, is that, well, they're going on what they were told. Told by whom? Now, at one point, because I forget which debate was it. Was it the one on? I think it was the one. Was it with Craig Evans? Off the top of my head, I'm thinking that Ehrman and Evans did an unbelievable program on Ehrman's book Forged. That's just what I'm remembering. I'm remembering a point that I thought Evans made against Ehrman listening to an unbelievable broadcast northbound 35th Avenue toward the bridge just south of Pinnacle Peak. The old index kicking in. It was before sunrise. Yeah, okay. I think that's who it was. Anyway, this is a part of the Ehrman thing that he demands. Now, let me just. I hate when I click on that.
Gospels show us that stories have been changed over the years. Let me.
Okay, I think that was in that debate where someone, and I thought it was Craig Evans, asked him if he had read. Thought I had it in here, actually. Thought I had kept it in here just to hold up for camera shots, but yeah, I don't see it down there. If he had read Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, what? Yeah, Darrell Bach. That's right, Darrell Bach. That's who it was. Yeah, that's who it was. Who did I? Craig Evans. No, it was Darrell Bach. It was Dallas guy. Darrell Bach. They're on Unbelievable, right? Ah, good, okay. Yes, well, and Bach, I think, was the one who asked him, have you not read Jesus and the Eyewitnesses? Richard Balkin's book? And he didn't show any familiarity with it. Now, interestingly enough, he's been criticized for that roundly. It had to have gotten back to him. Because at one point, I'm not sure we'll get into it, reviewing this. It may pop up, I don't know. But at one point, Ehrman almost with the, oh, please, attitude. Yeah. So, well, of course I have. Well, when Bach asked him, he didn't seem to have indicated it. But he doesn't take very seriously the idea that the eyewitnesses continued to exercise any meaningful influence in the maintenance, promulgation, purity of the oral preaching of the church prior to the writing of the canonical Gospels. He just doesn't, he seems to dismiss that. Just the same way as someone sent me a picture, I think Algo sent me a picture, of him rolling his eyes one of the times I mentioned the persecution of the early church during our debate. And it was just sort of like, oh, really? And it just strikes me as amazing that someone who does textual criticism would not recognize how vitally important the governmental attempt to destroy the religion producing these documents would be to a textual critic. I mean, that's just a given. There's an example of his tradition, his agnostic tradition, deeply influencing, and I would say corrupting his work in that particular field. But we have gone far enough on that one.
About the discrepancies of our Gospels, and I should just say up front, this is what convinced me that my views about the Bible were wrong when I was in my 20s. When I was diligently studying the New Testament Gospels in the original Greek, I started finding discrepancies. I knew people had said that. I didn't believe it because it was just a bunch of liberals saying these things. So I didn't believe them. But then I started studying. I started realizing there are discrepancies.
Now, just a second. Just 1 second. No. Don't. You don't need to face palm yet. Look, I know that I know his story. I've read his books. I know his quote-unquote testimony. Nominal Christian background, Episcopalian type stuff, but quote-unquote converted as a teenager, goes to Moody, goes to Wheaton, finally goes to Princeton. This is happening at Princeton. It doesn't happen at Wheaton and Moody. Now, is it possible that someone could avoid seriously thinking through synoptic issues, seriously thinking through the basic challenges? The thing that he mentions is Abiathar the high priest. Mark. That's a professor wrote on his paper, maybe Mark was just wrong. And that opened the floodgates. That's what allowed him to see the light. Is it possible that he could have just been so checked out during the course of Moody and Wheaton that he never did a synoptic study? Yeah. I suppose it's possible. Says a lot about the level of his study at those places. But yeah, I suppose it's possible. I have to keep in mind that what we've been doing at PRBC for over 9 years now. Now, it's not been 9 consecutive years in the sense of I do a lot of traveling these days. But we are this close to finishing a 9-year study of the Synoptic Gospels. And I don't have it in here. At least I don't think I have it in here. But somewhere, probably, yeah, the other. Oh, no, there it is. Right down there. I'm not sure if I'm too tethered to get to it. Yep, Synopsis Quattro Euangelium. There it is. Blue text right down. Get Ehrman out of the way. There you go. Right there. There is the Synopsis Quattro Euangelium. That's the Greek one, but we've been using the English one. Same thing. We have been studying the Synoptic Gospels from the start in the exact way that Bart Ehrman says it should be done. And that is in parallel. Not going through Matthew, then Mark, then Luke, then John, but going through in parallel and across. If you listen to him, you would think that most Christians never do that. And certainly no conservative Christians ever do that. Because if conservative Christians did that, then they would see all these discrepancies. Well, we have certainly seen all the discrepancies. And what's a discrepancy? Discrepancy is where Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not photocopies of each other. And who in the world would think that they should be? Well, evidently, Bart Ehrman. And evidently, Yusuf Ismail. And all the Muslims who will constantly point to any difference in phraseology, chronology, or anything else between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And say, see, they should be photocopies of each other. Don't worry about when the Quran isn't a photocopy of itself, but that's a different issue. You'll be able to see how that works out, well, somewhat, once we get the videos, which we should be getting fairly soon, from the debates in Durban. Anyway, it is a naive approach to just simply throw out all the discrepancies. I started seeing all these discrepancies. One of the reasons I've done what I've done at PRBC is to make sure that everyone who has been through that class, and of course, when you do it over a decade, obviously almost nobody has been through all of them. I can think of Brick Darrow and and Jim Callahan, and a few folks like that have now been through pretty much all of it. But I want to make sure that the students in my class, when they go to university, when they run into the people who look to this man as their leader, will be able to, with confidence, not with arrogance, but with confidence, respond to what the man has to say, respond to what they are taught in those classes. And I am very thankful that I can think of individuals who sat through that class, who at least sat through years of that class, went off to university, got in touch with me later on and said, guess what? You were right. That's exactly what I ran into. And it's exactly like you said. This is what they said. This is how they argued it. Wow, it's like you've been there. Yeah, just a little bit. And that's what I want. Would I suggest to teachers, pastors, and the listening audience that this might be a study you might want to consider? Well, you might not want to try to tackle the entire field, from beginning to end, a lot of material. That's an entire gospel study. But, pick out some of the key synoptic issues. Jairus' daughter, man, I've used that one a bunch of times, and mainly because Shabir Ali brought it up in the debate at Biola. We had just covered it in Sunday school. But there are, especially this coming spring, going into resurrection season. That's where we are right now, dealing with the Gospels as to those particular, and there's some tough issues there, but there are good, solid answers. And I know there's a fear on the part of a lot of ministers to overwhelm their people or to scare their people off. But you know what? We live in a day where these people predominate. They are the ones that have the media loves Bart Ehrman. They love John Dominic Crossan. They love the people that will give you a reason to not believe in Orthodox Christianity. And I just don't think we're doing our people any favors when we don't do the hard work of convincing them that they really need to be paying attention here. Let's knuckle down and do the work. And I understand you might be in a church where that would absolutely be like lighting a match in a room that's had a gas leak for the past 6 hours. Might be a bad thing. Okay, I get it. I understand. But your goal at least should be to move your people toward a level of maturity to where they'd be able to handle that kind of discussion. I really think something you might want to consider, might want to think about.
Once you realize that there, you start finding them, lots of them. There are important differences among our Gospels that cannot be reconciled with one another. You don't have to take my word for this. Simply read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John next to each other. The problem is when we read the New Testament, we tend to read all of Matthew. We go from the beginning to the end. It's about the life and death of Jesus. It's the gospel, life and death of Jesus. Then you read Mark, and it sounds like Matthew, life and death of Jesus. Then you go to Luke, it sounds like Matthew and Mark, life and death of Jesus. And John, that's a little different. It's basically the life and death of Jesus. And so it all sounds the same because you're reading them from top to bottom. The way to see that these Gospels are different from each other is not to read them from top to bottom. It's to read them across each other. Read a story in Matthew, then the same story in Mark, and the same story in Luke, and compare them in detail. Do it with the resurrection narratives. Just read for yourself the resurrection narratives and ask yourself, can you reconcile these Gospels? Who goes to the tomb? Okay, some women. Is it one?
Okay, now, I remember 3 or 4 years ago, one of the things I did at Covenant of Grace Church in St. Charles, which I will be there again. This will be, we skipped a year. We missed a year. This will be the 15th year, but it wasn't 15 years in a row. I was in Ukraine last year. And they didn't mind that because Pastor Van goes to Ukraine. He goes to Donetsk. I go to Ehrman, but we go to different places. But we both have a heart for the Ukrainian people, and so they didn't mind that I wasn't able to be there last year. But we were gonna try to work something out later on. It just didn't work out. But I will be in St. Charles first weekend in December, and I'm going to be doing something I actually haven't done before. The whole seminar will be on homosexuality. I really haven't done that. I've done debates. I've done single things, but the whole weekend? No. Well, when I say weekend, I doubt I'll be preaching on that on Sunday, but who knows? So I've got all sorts of keynote to develop, and it'll be good. It'll be good. So if you're around conference, I've sent the stuff to Micah, so hopefully we'll have a banner ad up here pretty soon, and we'll be doing homosexuality there. But about 3 years ago, there at St. Charles, and then I think I repeated it, so it may have been a little more than that. I repeated it at one of the street preaching conventions that I went to, Jeremiah Cry, I think, in New York, the one in New York. I did the same presentation where I went through, and we've done this before, we go through this. This is an Ehrmanism. It depends on which gospel you read. It depends on which gospel you read. It depends on which gospel you read. It is a surface level. I think it's a highly offensive because he knows that there are answers to every single one of these alleged discrepancies. He knows it, but he never mentions it. Never mentions it. I think this is dishonest. It is a mechanism, and I'm calling him on it. But we've gone through these, and we've walked through them point by point by point by point. Here's where he says this, but here's the reality. You know, he likes to throw John over against the synoptics as the day of the Passover. We go through the day of the Passover. It's so easy to do this. It is so easy to do this. I run into this in debates all the time. Muslims do this all the time. It's so easy. And Christians do it in response to Muslims. I mean, you really don't think that I could very easily put together an entire list of alleged contradictions in the Quran and just shoot them all out there? And to explain any one requires looking at context, background, being honest with it, and that takes a whole lot more time to answer it than it does to make the accusation. And so you just throw a bunch of stuff out here, and I've heard him do this over and over and over again. He doesn't even need his notes at this point because he's done this for years. But it's not meaningful argumentation, and he knows it. And that bothers me, really bothers me a lot.
Or several women. If it's several women, what are their names? It depends which gospel you read. What do they see there?
It depends which gospel you read. In other words, some gospels give more data than others. Some are very brief and do not give sufficient data to answer the questions. Others give more information and sufficient information to answer more of the questions. And some are in between. And who are you, Bart Ehrman, to judge the motivations of Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Do you know all the situations they were in? Do you know everyone that they knew? Do you know who was still alive when they were writing? Might there be a reason why one person writing in one area would write something where he protects someone's identity and someone writing someplace else doesn't need to do that? Have you thought about any of those things? No. You just throw the stuff out there and destroy the faith of people, and maybe just hope that they will never find out later on that there were actually meaningful answers. How do you do that? I don't get it. I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror in the morning, so I can't argue that way. I can argue that way against all sorts of positions. There are lots of arguments that would make me, quote unquote, more popular. But I can't use them. That consistency thing again.
Do they see a man there, or two men there, or do they see an angel there? Depends which gospel you read. Was the stone already rolled?
So are those contradictory things? Are you really seriously saying that seeing a man or seeing an angel, you think that angels have wings, and so they, well, a man wouldn't have wings. You really think that these books being written, this is one of the reasons you have to put them so late, but what if they were being written in the same time period where the eyewitnesses are still alive? You don't think that... What makes these contradictory, in other words? Do you really think that saying man is meant to be differentiated from angel, man not angel? Because he's a messenger delivering a supernatural message. So was he someone from some other city? Yeah, you got to have the halo, yeah. And then one or two, again, anybody who for a second takes seriously the analysis of differing accounts of any historical event knows that some people will emphasize the one person who spoke, will not mention other people that were with him. Other people will mention the specific number. Other will just simply talk about a crowd. If there was one, then if there were two, then there had to be at least one, right? Again, the assumption is these are all contradictions. They don't have to be, unless you're functioning on the guilty until proven innocent basis, which is generally how Bart Ehrman argues, and the people, again, who then follow him. Because remember, Bart Ehrman's one man, but he needs to recognize, and I've pointed out to him, he wasn't happy about it, but I've pointed out to him there are a lot of people who follow after him and utilize his argumentation, and maybe not even as carefully as he makes it, but they're there. And when he plays with his conclusions, when he doesn't act fairly and consistently in his argumentation, that only becomes magnified each time it goes down the road until you end up with the wacko people that my daughter ran into in college, who clearly start with him and then go off into pretty wild and crazy and zany stuff after.